We have experienced an ever widening gulf in politics um, and attitudes in society throughout the world. The United States is not immune. And so I'm going to discuss that, and I'm going to focus on the United States, not the world. In this video, I'll talk about what has happened, and I'm going to follow up with another video with ideas on how to try to narrow the gulf and solve some of the problems in our political climate. And these aren't arrogant ideas on my part. These are things that have been discussed for a while, but I'm just going to bring them up for people's thought. Ultimately, it's going to be our younger generations who find their way forward. It's not going to affect me. I will be long gone as these things foment and come to a head. And so I just throw it out there for what it's worth for people to think about. Democrats and Republicans have historically shared common goals in America, but differed on how best to achieve them. More a difference in process than overall philosophy. But the widening gulf has resulted in increasingly wild extremes. The two sides no longer share really common visions for America. And one only need to look at the recent string of presidents to recognize how wild the swings have been back and forth of the pendulum. From President Bush, the second President Bush, to President Obama, to President Trump, to President Biden, and back to President Trump. Those are extreme changes in overall philosophy and visions for America. The battle has now become the far left versus the far right, instead of what really motivates and is of concern to the middle of America, the centrists. The far left is concerned with such things as gender rights, the environment, income inequality, and not without justification, of course. The far right is concerned with Christian values, parental rights, the economy. Not to say that the left isn't concerned with the economy, they are, but in a different way. As I said, income inequality. And just like the far left has justification for its concerns, so does the far right. But the extremes of the two sides have, in my estimation at least, come to frighten one another, which is what is driving political discourse in the United States. The left is afraid of authoritarianism, assault on our liberties, assaults on women's rights. And to be absolutely clear, these concerns are absolutely justified. I understand them, I share them. One thing I would note, though, is a lot of the authoritarianism is coming from an administration that in 3.5 years will be gone. Hopefully, the right will readjust its sails at that point. We'll see. On the far left, you have leadership who is increasingly gaining a representative role in the Democratic Party, who identify as democratic socialists, such as AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and others. And just the mention of socialists and socialism scares many Americans, notably Cuban Americans and others from communist countries, because they understand the ramifications of communism and socialism. And so the mere mention scares them, as it does for older Americans, myself included. And a lot of young people can't understand and relate to that. But for us older Americans who grew up during the Cold War, we think of the nuclear threat, we think of the hatred of Western politics and Western society. by the Cold War countries and the communist countries. And we remember some of us being having drills in grade school to hide under our desks in the event of a nuclear attack, as though that would really save us. But we actually did that. And older Americans still believe, and I think justifiably so, that America is the greatest land of opportunity in the world. At the same time, though, younger voters have become increasingly discouraged, and with justification. And, you know, I always say when I discuss these issues with friends and relatives that instead of just viewing things from our experience and our outlook, it's always helpful, as the proverb goes, to walk a mile in the other person's shoes. And so I try to understand it from young people's perspectives, and their concerns are justified based on their experience. Millennials are reportedly the first generation not financially better off in America than their parents' generation. In 2023, the top 1% of Americans held approximately 30% of the wealth. That's up from just 22.8% back in 1990. It's a trend that has been continuing and steepening. As a consequence of these economic considerations, 62% of 18 to 29-year-olds, according to the Cato Institute, view socialism favorably. So that's a real concern, and I think all of us owe it to one another and to society to understand each other and the reasons for those concerns, and to look at alternatives and solutions. And I would start out by saying this. I support democracy. I believe in democracy, and I believe in free enterprise, subject to controls, which will be the subject of a later video, the follow-up video to this. Democracy has its problems, but as Winston Churchill famously said, democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the others. And I think that's well said, and there's a lot of truth to it. Democracy is fraught with all kinds of problems. It is slow, it is cumbersome, the process takes a long time. It does not have the ability to adapt quickly, for example, like an authoritarian regime. But just the mention of an authoritarian regime is frightening to those of us who cherish our rights and freedoms. So the point is that I believe democracy is worth fighting for. Communism has always resulted in oppressing, not raising peoples and societies. To mention just a handful: the Soviet Union, China, Cuba, Venezuela. Socialism disincentivizes work and innovation. I heard a college professor some years back explain it thusly. He said, imagine everybody has to pull a cart. That's the goal, to pull this cart. And there's some people who are not able or have limited ability, and so they ride in the cart. And increasingly, people pulling the cart decide they no longer want to pull it. They want to ride in the cart. And so they leave pulling the cart and get in the cart and are pulled. And more people abandon pulling the cart in favor of riding in it, until pretty soon there's nobody, or at least not enough people, to pull the cart forward. That is, in a nutshell, the problem with socialism. Without an incentive to pull the cart, to work, to be prosperous, to develop, people lose the incentive to work and they stop, and we stop being productive. There is also a failure to understand the tax system. There is always this hue and cry among leftists, typically, about taxes, and then on the right that the tax system is not fair to some in the working class. There is some truth to the tax burden, but people don't realize how the tax system works. And the reality is the top 1% of earners and wealthy in the United States pay 30 to 40% of taxes. The top 20% pay more than 80%. So it's not fair to say that the wealthy as a whole do not pay their fair share. They do. And the fact is, this is a great quote I heard a long time ago, we don't make the poor wealthy by making the wealthy poor. If we overtax entrepreneurs and those who work hard, it is going to disincentivize risk-taking to develop goods, products, and services. Without the incentive, we wouldn't have things like all the technology we have today, Microsoft, Google, many of the different services we have. People love Amazon. That was incentivized by, all those were incentivized by the prospect of profits and becoming very successful. It is also true, though, that there are loopholes in the tax system and that there are many very wealthy, ultra wealthy billionaires who pay little to no taxes. But those loopholes, those slips in the system, can be, if not eliminated, at least reduced and minimized through adjustments to the tax code and other legislation, instead of just abandoning capitalism altogether. Young generations are indoctrinated to see the world in a binary way. Everything is good or bad, it's black or white. One form of government is good or bad, another is good, not bad, another is bad, not good. And life is more nuanced than that. Life is actually most usually gray. And so what I would suggest that we do is, instead of looking at democracy as something that is failed and throwing it away, we look at democracy in America as something that is fractured and has problems, but is worth fighting for and saving, and that can in fact be repaired. And so in my next video, I'm going to discuss ideas on how to do just that.